Hello, everyone, and welcome to the tail end of 2023. This is going to be a very special episode of the Paleo Post Podcast, as not only are we going to be recapping some of the best stories of the year, but we're going to be talking about the future of the show as well. And we are just so excited. So let's get started. Guys, first and foremost, and I'm sorry she can't be here to say goodbye for herself. We are losing our co-host Genevieve, not forever, and she will make reappearances, but life and being in the field, it just gets busy, guys? And so we got together, and she has a wonderful colleague who is on the first art team with her as well, so comes from a similar background of rock art and storytelling and understanding that perspective of human culture and identity, and that would be the last guest that we had on The Story of Us, Dr. George Nash. And here he is, our new co-host. Um, this is, I do need to just let everyone remember this is an audio only, so we will not be doing video at all when it's posted, so make sure you are listening to what we talk about, and then maybe we'll throw up some pictures that are related to what we're going to be talking about, especially since it's such a recap of 2023. So, we're just going to take some turns talking about some stories like we usually do, and we're going to try to find our flow with you guys, just like Genevieve and I did when we first started. And we know you guys are going to stick with us, but we ask for you to give us a little patience here as we figure this out. So, George, how are you?
Well, okay for the moment. I suppose I can tell you and the people listening. It's just one of those sod's law stories. I was due an operation on my eyes on Wednesday. Got cancelled whilst I was actually in hospital, in fact. And then, blow me, yesterday, my right eye burst. Had a big eye. It's because of my diabetic condition, and so I'm not quite partially blind in both eyes, but my eyesight has been reduced by about 40%. So this week has been rather rubbish. However, we are talking about the year, and the year, as you probably already know, has been very, very exciting. There's been some really interesting things that I've been getting up to, and some of my colleagues as well. We've been halfway around the globe, sort of searching for the piece de resistance, as they say, piece de resistance of trying to get to the holy grail of finding out who's doing the art. Is it Neanderthals or is it early modern humans like us? So that's been my sort of big rationale over the last 12 months. What about yourself, Seth?
Well, besides being a full-time student and working and running the World of Paleoanthropology, I've just been trying to absorb as much information as I can about everything going on and trying to survive in this crazy, crazy world. And
Mm.
I don't have news to announce yet, guys, but soon, soon after the holidays, I'm going to have some very exciting news to tell everyone, and I'm looking forward to that. It's been a very interesting year so far. Yeah, definitely. A lot has happened. And we've lost some good people in the field. Um it's a good year to be reflective a lot on what's happened, I think, in the field of paleoanthropology and anthropology in general. So I think
Mm.
it's a good time and a good chance for us to just kind of sit back and talk about the year in review and not only some of the biggest stories, but maybe even some of the biggest blunders of 2023. And I
Yes,
think maybe you know some of the ones I'm thinking of.
I certainly do. Yes, yes.
Um,
I think it's what's interesting as well. You say about people leaving the field. I'd imagine that's a metaphor for people who've passed on, because there has been quite a surprising number of people
yes,
who have passed on. But I will say, and I think you'll probably agree with me on this one, that although they've passed on, they left one hell of a legacy for
absolutely.
people like you and me to learn from and take forward.
Absolutely. And, as people in this field, I think that's all we can hope to do, is to leave the knowledge that we spent so much time acquiring throughout our lifetimes and leave it in a way that other people can benefit from it even after we're gone. At least, that's a goal of mine to have that continue on in some form or another. These days, they're totally off topic, and I'm trying to remember what they're called now. But you know how there's chatbot AIs where you can just talk to it and it does whatever. Well, you can actually like upload people's memory, not their specific
Mm,
memory. Like let's you upload a biography into an AI, and then you can practically talk to that person as if they were alive. So, I
mm.
mean, we're entering a very strange future of storytelling and
Mm.
recapping what's going on. But I think for this podcast, we'll keep it pretty simple. Just two humans, talking to each other.
How do you know you're talking to a human? That's the
I
thing.
was, I was about to make a similar joke. So, I'm glad we're on the same
Yeah,
page. That's
yeah,
a good
yeah,
sign.
yeah. It's
Um,
always an interesting point, Seth. Is that we have this story in the UK where we say, if you had a chance, who would you have dinner with on a dinner party? Yeah, on a dinner party list. And one of them is a woman I'd love to have interviewed, but she passed away in 1968, and that was Dorothy Garrett. And Dorothy Garrett was, I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, was the first professor of archaeology in Great Britain. So not only was she a woman in very much a man's world then, um, but she stood her ground. She did some amazing things, and she's again in terms of people who are studying Paleolithic history, she's one of the demigods, one of the people that I really admire for what she was doing and how active she was in the field. She was born in the 19th century, I will hasten to add, the late 19th century, and died in 1968. But she did things that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later on in this podcast that I've been involved in. So again, when we talk about legacy, it's a legacy that I'm pursuing of hers in order to sort of add on and build up the evidence of a particular area of the world, which is northern Israel.
and that's definitely Israel is an aspect of, and people might be going, "Oh, Israel, I don't want to hear about that right now." We're not talking about politics or anything like that, which that's not a place on this show. Israel, the Levant, is an extraordinarily important Paleolithic region for our. Because honestly, on this show, I actually don't think I've had anyone from like the University of Tel Aviv or anyone who can speak to what's a big site there, the Ramsh. I can't remember right now, but there's a few very interesting sites in Israel that we have
Yeah.
not talked about at all. So hearing
Well,
about that will be very interesting.
Well, the big area that I've been working in, and again I couldn't make it up for a person of my, I suppose my sort of my academic standing. I've been working in Mount Carmel, which is where Skull Cave is. It's I'll talk to you a little bit about that later on. But it's a remarkable story for me, and it's a personal story for me as well. I mean, it's one of those sort of being in the right place at the right time and meeting the right people. And the result is I've been working out there. I've actually been out there since 2014 on and off, but I started in the Negev Desert, and I've been working way north ever since. And again, there's a funny story because I literally went north into the Golan Heights for something completely different. And but again, I'll talk about that as part of my review of 2023 a little bit later on.
Right, right. Well, with that, I say we dive into the stories that we have curated for this
Yeah,
episode. These are in no particular order. It's not like the first story we talk about is the most important of 2023. These are just stories that George and I personally picked. Him from his own personal experiences, some of them, which is just amazing, something I can't do just yet. So mine are going to be my favorite news related stories that I've come across. And some of them we've talked on season one of the podcast with Genevieve, and we're going to go into a little more in depth in some of them. So the first story that I want to talk about is the near half a million year old, what they're dubbing as near Lincoln logs that were found near a waterfall in Zambia. And this is just so important, I think, to our understanding of the imagination and creativity of what humans have been doing for so much longer than we have thought them capable of. I mean, the oldest rock art that we know of, which is a huge symbol of abstract thought, is about how old?
Hmm.
Not including supposed Naledi engravings or Neanderthal. What's like the oldest Homo sapien rock art we know of?
I would suggest, Seth. I think it's probably. I mean, I would say Blombus because of the secure
Right.
dating we've got there. For those of you who don't know Blombus, it's a large cave site which is on the southern part of South Africa, halfway between the Antarctic Ocean and the Indian Ocean, in a very, very temperate climate. It's been excavated for the last 40 years, but meticulously excavated, and there they have some remarkable discoveries. Probably the most famous one, which was about 15, 20 years ago, where they found within a stratigraphic sequence a block, a small block, maybe 5 or 6 centimeters long, an oblong block, and inscribed on it, on this oblong block made of hematite, were a series of scratched diagonal and cross marks, geometric forms, I would call them. And that was secure within a stratigraphic sequence of 77,000 uh, uh, years ago. And then last year, or the year before, they found a piece of stone in a lower sequence, which was around about 80,000 years, with a sort of, I suppose, again, another hematite sort of spread across a stone. And I put it through D-stretch, and it looks like one of those sort of enlarged thigh sections of a human figure. Um, but it could be anything. But nonetheless, it was found and dated to 80,000 years ago. So something's going on in early modern human prehistory in Blobbers Cave at that time.
Right. So, and for those who might not understand the significance that anthropologists assign art to our cognitive abilities, it's, I mean, as we just talked about in our last episode, you and I are both firmly Team Neanderthal when it comes to they were capable of making art.
Hoo ha!
Now, but even that is still debated. So the fact that we were able to comprehend making a structure out of wood, and again, this could have been a frequent thing. Wood just deteriorates so easily that 500,000 years ago, the fact that we have even these two pieces left is astonishing.
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
we don't know what this structure exactly was. It could have been part of a dock or something that was going into the water. But the fact that what probably was Homo heidelbergensis was capable of making structures completely opens up in my mind a gate to what were quote non-humans capable of without
Yeah,
sapiens.
yeah. Again, I think I mentioned this in the last program that I did with you, Seth. It's all about that mindset. We need to
Right.
take ourselves out of the mindset of a 21st century anthropologist or archaeologist and start trying to think about how we look at the processes. And this is the problem. You've really hit it on the nail in terms of the idea of preservation. If I'm wearing my archaeological head on, remember, I am looking at, when we're looking at the Paleolithic, anything from the Paleolithic, we're looking at maybe 1, 2, 3% of the total material culture. If we're lucky, a few stones, maybe a hearth here and there, maybe a little bit of rock art, if we're very, very lucky. But that's it. We have very little else to work on, really. And this is where we have to start thinking or bringing in things like philosophy, ethnography, anthropology for for the archaeology question in order to try and understand what is going on. But there are other things we have to bring in as well to try and make sense of this very, very fragmented past.
And I think that's something that's so beautiful about paleoanthropology and anthropology in general is how interdisciplinary it is.
Hmm.
It used to be so cut and dry that I think so much was missed. Well, I mean, just we know today that, and this is something that needs to be done in Rising Star, is you can test literally the sediments that fossils were laying in for DNA, for genetic material. So imagine all of the archaeological digs that have been done over the last 100 years where all the sifting, all the dirt, all the whatever was just thrown away. And all the
Yeah.
information, data that was just lost because we weren't interpreting things in a way that we knew how to do. And we've learned so much from that. And who knows what we'll be doing 100 years from now. But so when we're talking about this structure, I might be mistaken, but I think before this find, the oldest wooden structure was about 9,000 years old. So we're talking about a huge gap. I mean, a huge gap. And to think, as you said, we only have 3% or somewhere around there, to think that there was nothing in between or that it was a rare occurrence, if they were already doing it 500,000 years ago, I guarantee it happened a lot in between now and
Mm,
then.
mm,
And I just wonder, it really brings in so many questions about even things like Neanderthal daily life. Like, well, if Homo heidelbergensis was creating structures like that, what structures were Neanderthals creating, who were supposedly more advanced just by where they were in the timeline? And it's just so important, I think, to go along with what you said of breaking that modern understanding of, well, if Homo sapiens wouldn't have done it that way, it must not have been done.
yeah, 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 exactly. And I think we also have a problem, as you said. This is quite really the essence of the archaeological problem is the survival of archaeological remains. So, for those of you who don't know, I come from the UK, but I work largely in Wales. So I should say to our listeners, "Shwmae bach down." Um, uh, and the problem we have in Wales is that nearly all the soils that we have, which hold archaeological evidence, is the soils are very acidic.
Mm.
So, bone, teeth, you name it, wood, it disappears. And you have a very unique geomorphological situation to bring up a good sequence of archaeology because you won't find it usually because of the acidic soil. So, this has been a problem, and it will continue to be a problem for anybody doing archaeology. Or an anthropologist, we're working with archaeologists to try and make an understanding of what's going on in the deep, distant past, such as the stuff you're talking about in Zambia, for example. Because I dare say that you've got those timber pieces within that archaeological site, but I would suggest probably very little else, which is a problem.
They found a tool that they think could have carved the wood, and that was about it, I think. This very unique looking hand axe. Like, very unique. It does not look like other Acheulean hand axes. It actually looks like a hatchet almost.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
And they didn't really talk about it at all. It was only very briefly mentioned in the press release with some
yeah.
pictures, which I found interesting that they didn't want to talk more about the lithics. Maybe they're not ready to yet, I guess. Or
Yeah, maybe there's a conundrum somewhere where the lithics
yeah,
maybe are a particular style which represents something which is much later or much earlier than the actual wooden structures. And
that's
that's always a conundrum with a lot of archaeological sites. It also sometimes depends how you dig it, because the photographs I've seen of that particular site, correct me if I'm wrong, Seth, but were they not sort of waterlogged remains as well?
yeah, they were pretty
Yeah,
waterlogged. Yeah,
yeah. So there's always that problem of turbulation,
right.
bioturbulation, for example, whereby you're going to get sort of things from above working their way down into the sequence, into the actual archaeological sequence, and that can sometimes skewer the evidence.
That's a very good point. Yeah, who knows if that tool even had anything to do with the wood?
Yeah,
That's a good point. Just because it's there. I mean, we're talking about just the wood alone, 500,000 year span. So a lot could have happened then. Um, there is another story that I want to talk about a little later on that I just thought about that we hadn't talked about previously, and we'll get into it in a little. That involves stone tools and possibly the birth of the Acheulean tradition. and we can get into that. But I know you want to talk about the northern frontier and some of your
Yeah,
experience with your own knowledge about it. So why don't we talk about that a little bit? First of all, what do I mean when I say the northern frontier?
it's a term that I've just started to use. In fact, I don't know if I'm the unique one that has come up with this idea of a northern frontier, but we know between 10,000, say 40 to 45,000 years before present, that there was a great big stonking ice sheet right across most of northern Europe. And the geomorphologists who I've worked with, one or two of them, in fact, they've actually mapped out, with good precision, looking at the changes in the geomorphology, the actual ice margin. So we can actually chart the ice margin from northern Germany right through across the North Sea into the British Isles, and then cutting across Britain, skirting north first of all into to almost to the base of the Pennines, then coming down through the Midlands, and then skirting along the Bristol Channel to the northern part of the Bristol Channel into the Atlantic Ocean. And again, this sequence is well and truly tried and tested. And so I was alerted to this idea when I was an undergraduate, in fact, when I read a textbook saying, of course, there was no human occupation or very little human occupation uh, of, uh, of modern humans, people from the Paleolithic, living beyond or north of the Loire Valley in France. So, and they base that on because it's very, very cold, because you've got permafrost conditions. But as I said to you in my last meeting with you, there was a guy called J.J. Weimer who was he was a very good archaeologist, but he was one of these people who liked to collect data. And so one of his big books, and it was a massive book, it was, uh, charted all the Mesolithic or the Paleolithic or the Upper Paleolithic, the Middle Paleolithic, and a little bit of the Lower Paleolithic sites in the British Isles. And of course, as you will imagine, it was about half a dozen pages of the Upper Paleolithic and half a dozen pages of the Middle Paleolithic. So it just tells you that maybe what the textbook was correct. This was in 1977. But as we know, since 1977, there's been a very different approach to archaeology. We've had, certainly in the British Isles, we've had these incentives by the gravel extraction industry to give funding for anything that is going to be taken out as gravel, as a gravel quarry. There's funding for archaeology and for paleoenvironmental, and etc., etc. So from these gravel quarries, such as I give one good example, Boxgrove is a good example. And again, some of your listeners will know about Boxgrove. It's probably one of the most important lower Paleolithic sites we have in the British Isles, certainly probably in northwestern Europe, in fact. That was done for what we call an aggregates levy, which was money given to archaeology, paleoenvironmental, and also natural history to go out, excavate, and understand the gravel sequences of this particular quarry before they started quarrying, and I thought which was a very good idea. And so we've over the last 20 odd years, 30 odd years, we've had this levy. I don't think it exists anymore, but at the time when it did exist, there was some very, very good pieces of work going on with anything to do with gravel quarry extraction. So we have a damn good idea about what's going on in terms of the paleoenvironmental history over the last 40,000 years plus. Obviously, um, when I mentioned Boxgrove, we can go back actually nearly 700,000 years ago. So
Right.
we're talking about a long sequence of a geomorphological stratigraphy within these gravel sequences. And certainly, if there's archaeology there, then the archaeologists pick them up. So it's a very, very exciting. Was a very exciting time. I still think it is a very exciting time. But what I'm trying to say in a nutshell is that basically we've rethought about how um, Paleolithic communities were occupying, albeit maybe seasonally, um, the ice margins of this northern frontier. So this is basically where the permafrost meets the ice. And you might think to yourself, well, what's the attractions of doing this? Because you've got very, very cold summer temperatures, minus 10, 15, maybe minus 20 in some areas of the ice margin. You've also got permafrost, So what's growing there? Is it just a barren sort of Siberian landscape, or do you have within the summer months sedges, mosses, lichens, grasses growing which attract megafauna? If it attracts megafauna, mammoth, bison, horse, reindeer, elk, then it's going to attract human communities. They're going to follow these animals like they do today. We talk about anthropology. This is what modern hunter-fish gatherers are doing in various parts of the world. So that so basically they're following the quarry, killing the quarry. They're creating temporary encampments. And again, we found one or two of those encampments in Wales. A place called Coedwig Camp is a good example, which is in South Wales, just south of the ice margin. Bardsey Island, Colby Island is another one, and also on the Gower Coast where I've been doing my work. So this is what attracts me about this northern frontier thing. And one of the things that we have now, we have 4 areas of interest within the British Isles, which obviously have a lot of good Paleolithic material coming out of the caves and the rock shelters, but we also have their art as well. Those areas are Creswell Crags, which again your listeners will know about. We have the Mendip Hills, which is just south of Bristol, where there's a lot of cave activity in the limestone. And again, a little bit of art is coming out. A lot of portable art is coming out as well. So we're getting decorated ivory, decorated horn, decorated bone and antler. So it tells us that something really quite special is going on within those 2 areas. And then we have another 2 areas which are just starting to yield really interesting stuff. Although it's been known about, there has been Paleolithic material coming out of these areas for quite some time, as far back as the late 19th century, which is the Wye Valley, which is in Herefordshire, which is on the Welsh-Hereford border. Again, it's an ice margin area. And then we have the Gower Coast, where I've been working over the last 15 years, where we have found not just portable art, we've also found rock art there as well, along with a really good sequence of lithic industries. And again, I draw your attention to, or draw the attention to your listeners about Pavilion Cave, which was a cave which was excavated in 1823, then in 1912 by William Solis. And one thing I didn't say about Pavilion Cave, which I think I should say now because I think it's very important, the guy who excavated Pavilion Cave in 1823 was a guy called Richard Buckland. Now, Richard Buckland was a geologist who was also a priest. So he was the Dr. Reverend William Buckland. And he had a really great idea to get out of that problem of, are you a scientist or are you a priest? Do you believe in the idea that the world was created in 4004 BC? Or do you believe that the idea that the Earth is much older than 4004 BC and you can wipe out the idea of God made the Earth in 7 days, or 6 days, and a day's rest? And how he got out of it was, this is an absolute cracker. He said, yes. So he said, yes, the world was made in 6 days and God took a rest, but each day represents 1 billion years. Absolutely fantastic. And that's how you get out of it. Because we all know now, as scientists, that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and he wasn't too far out. But he got him out of a hole. And really, in many respects, although we've got people like Lyell, who's quite a famous geologist of the late 18th, early 19th century, I think Buckland said it really well by trying to bridge that big problem between religion, or the philosophy of religion, and the science of geology. So you heard it here first.
I've never heard that. That is fascinating, and
it's fascinating.
Yeah, going along with what we said, not to argue for religion, because while I'm a spiritual person, and that's besides what we're talking about, I am not a religious person. Going along with what do modern humans conceive as certain things? Because if I was a god, maybe 1 billion years is a day, you know what I mean? So, who knows? But that's a really interesting way of, like you said, trying to bridge that gap of, and that's very important in like the work that I do in science communication, because especially here in the States, there's so many people that are still very hard-lined on creationism.
Yeah.
And even just saying the word evolution can upset them and make them angry. So, like, for instance, I was talking to one of my mentors at the Smithsonian because I was going to do a presentation at my job at a local family thing. They asked me to do it, but I felt pretty uncomfortable because I know everyone's very religious there.
Mm, mm,
And she just gave me the advice to use the words like change over time instead of evolved from, or because it's just so much softer and easier to digest. So there's
yeah.
definitely that skill of bridging that gap. And I think that's something that I really hope this podcast does is we talk about maybe some complex ideas, carbon dating and how that works, but then we bring it down to a level that anyone who's listening, as Genevieve and I used to say, we like to make people the most interesting person at the dinner table. You listen to the podcast and then you go to a dinner party the next day, no one's going to listen to anything but you because you've got amazing stories. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
you and I are gonna continue that, especially because you have so many stories of your own. But
It's to
back to
do with my age. It's to do with my age, Seth.
but just continuing back to what you were saying about the northern frontier and everything, and the lithics and oh, I had another question actually before you
Yeah.
continue. So the UK, obviously much of it was covered in ice for a good period of time prior to this last, glacial maximum. I always forget this. Were there Neanderthals in the UK ever?
Yes, there was.
Okay. Okay.
In fact, it's really quite interesting. In fact, because that we have one cave. Well, actually, we have only one bit of evidence of actual physical human remains or hominin remains belonging to Neanderthal, and that is a site called Potnewith Cave. So
Mm,
nowhere else in the British Isles apart from Potnewith Cave. And Potnewith Cave is in northern Wales. And at the time of the last Devensian ice sheet, so between 10,000 and 40,000 before present, um, there was ice. It was a very, very cold area of northwestern Europe. Again, that northern frontier. So the ice must have covered all the limestone caves and all the valley locations for cave sites for 30 odd thousand years, maybe more, 35,000 years. So that tells us something interesting. And we had a guy called Stephen Oldhouse Green, who's now no longer with us, but a very, very, very good, meticulous archaeologist. In fact, he did the flint assemblage along with Elizabeth Walker from the National Museum of Wales on Pavlin Cave, which we've just been talking about. But he also excavated meticulously Pontsnewith Cave up in North Wales, and he found, wait for it, I think 6 Neanderthal teeth.
okay.
And that's it. That's it. So somewhere in the stratigraphy that he hasn't excavated, there's
Right.
probably some very, very tantalising bone evidence belonging to Neanderthals in there. So that's it. But we do have within the British Isles, quite a remarkable lithic assemblage of flint tools. And I've mentioned Coigan Camp already in Wales. Again, that was a Neanderthal, not just a Neanderthal cave site, but also it was an encampment. So they were actually camping outside. And that was done by the late Jeff Wainwright, who's just passed away about a few years ago. So there's a lot of really interesting, exciting things. I mean, I think it's really exciting. I mean, I'm happy to be alive in this sort of revolution, this new revolution of exploratory archaeology within this part of the world, because we are really coming across some very interesting things. And it's all kicked off in the last 30 odd years, and
Yeah.
I'm pleased to be part of that sort of revolution. So it's really, again, very, very exciting indeed. And now, in terms of putting that into context, in terms of the Neanderthal range, as we all know, the Neanderthal range is really from the Iberian Peninsula, so Portugal and Spain, right through to Siberia, and it cuts off North Africa, the Middle East, and then goes as far north as probably northern Germany, obviously Neanderthal Valley, of course. But it's just basically like a cigar-like shape of
Mm,
of the Neanderthal range, and so the UK, the British Isles, does fit into that range. But I say we all we have is 6 teeth and an awful lot of lithics. So that's good news. And again, we can take the lithics way back to 250, 300,000 when Neanderthals start to emerge as the dominant hominin within this part of the world.
Right. Okay.
But no art. But no art yet. No art yet.
No art yet. No art yet. Okay. Um. So when we're talking about the northern frontier and everything, and you're talking about what I'm curious to know because I can imagine a few things. You mentioned you can practically literally see the line that the glacier took across the continent. And I just took a drones and satellites class where we did a lot of work on imaging because I'm working on a GIS certificate.
Yeah.
And I can imagine like looking at satellite imagery how that would be done, but how was that found out exactly throughout the whole line of this?
It's quite simple, really, Seth. Back in the back in the 20th century, and certainly when I was an undergraduate, I'll mention one name. I'll mention two names: um, Mike Walker and John Lowe. They were a part of a remarkable group of people who really kicked off what we would call quaternary science. And again, as you said before, it's a multidisciplinary. When you start talking about quaternary science, you're not just talking about the quaternary. You also talk about the science. You're talking about all manner of things: geomorphology, geography, history, paleovegetation, paleoenvironmental. You name it, it all comes into fashion. And really, they were part of a revolution of academics who were not archaeologists, they were geomorphologists, they were geographers. Another guy called B.Q. Bowen in Wales did an awful lot of work, but basically they went into the landscape and they were looking for periglacial features. So periglacial is what I mean by that is it's features which are south or just in front of the glaciers. So we're looking for things like pingos, which are these large circular features you see in the landscape, which would have held ice, but because of the permafrost or the slow deglaciation of the area, they slowly but surely melted or the water went away, and you got a buildup of peat or sphagnum moss and clays and things. And it's a very, very nice stratigraphy. You can go down, depths of maybe 9, 10, 15 meters. So they're very, very large sort of features within the landscape. You've got eskers, you've got ice wedges. So they can work out where these features were and where they weren't. So anything north of those features was probably ice. The ice, and also they can work out as well with a thing called eustatic rise. So basically, you've got the sea level rising because obviously the glaciers are melting, so the meltwater is going into the sea, and you've got a sea level rise from the last glaciation of between 50 and 70 meters around the British Isles, but it does vary slightly from area to area. But at the same time, you've also got the land rising as well, because remember, the weight of the ice would have pushed or kept the land mass down. But when that ice goes away, the land starts to rise. But it rises at a different level to the sea level. So you've got this very, very difficult thing to try and work out about which is moving first or which is moving fastest. Is it the sea level rise or the rise of the land masses? It's usually the rise of the land masses is moving slightly quicker than the sea level rise, and it's still moving. So in Scotland, for example, we're going up about 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters a year. We've got the Skagerrak in Denmark, which is rising, but central Denmark is sinking because of eustatic rise. So this is what these people have been doing. Mike Walker, John Lowe, B.Q. Bowen. These are just three people of many who've been working within the quaternary world to try and work out what's going on. And obviously, they are in turn are part of my interdisciplinary research area, because without their knowledge, I can't say the things I want to say about caves or rock shelters and about rock art, because that's part of that geomorphological process in limestone areas. So it is a remarkable sort of thing that's going on at the moment with in terms of trying to understand the landscape, and that's again it's been done by first of all going out on foot into these wildernesses and trying to work out what's going on, but also, as we know, in the last 10, 15 years, We've got things like GIS, LiDAR, and all manner of photogrammetric um, techniques going on, which can actually read the landscape. I would say better, because obviously I think you've got to be, if you're actually in the landscape, you can look for these features in more minute detail. But we are getting some interesting patterns emerging, certainly in northwestern Europe and along that northern frontier, to work out where those ice margins were.
Absolutely. Okay, that makes a lot of sense now that you've mentioned those features and everything that they look for, because of course there would be things. And I'm really liking this, guys. We aren't even on technically episode 1 of season 2 because this is a recap, and I'm learning so much from our new quote. I had, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me when you think about it that the Earth would rise. It's less condensed. It doesn't have as much weight on it after the glaciers are gone. But I never thought about it. It just never. You hear about the sea level rising when the glaciers melt, but I've never thought about the Earth actually like decompressing, and that's amazing.
Yeah,
Uh, Now, to go into our next story, I think we should kind of make an amalgamation here because you want to talk about the colonization of the Americas, which we've learned so much about in this last year. And I wanted to talk about a specific location. Again, something else we've talked about on the show that's had even more updates since we've last talked about it, and that's White Sands National Park in New Mexico. And I'll lead off with just that aspect and some things we've talked about, and then we'll discuss it in depth. So first of all, um, as listeners of this podcast know specifically, because I have tried very hard to get rid of the Clovis first idea. I've tried very hard because that idea has been dead in the water for so long. It's not even funny. And then, we have worse ideas like the Solturians coming across the Atlantic to the East Coast. I mean, there's a lot of ideas about how people got to the Americas. And the biggest thing is, though, the reason that Clovis first, and even though they were a very large culture in the Americas and we have a lot of archaeological evidence of them being here, is we have sites in Brazil that are much older, which is much farther south than where the Clovis were known. And then we have a site in New Mexico in a national park called White Sands, where around this old lake bed, I think it's an old lake bed, I think it's dried up now. Um,
it is. Yes,
they Okay. They found the footprints of people, bare feet. So, and, they looked at this and they were able to tell that they were not, new. They were clearly quite old. And they originally did a pollen analysis, I believe, of the last time or the date of the pollen that was in the footprints. And they came up with a date of, I think, 22 to 24,000 years ago, which is well beyond any time the Clovis were here, which I think was more 10,000 years ago. And that was extremely controversial. People did not like it. They're like, there wasn't enough science done. Why were people there? There's no archaeological evidence. We just have footprints. We have nothing else. The dates are probably wrong. So they sent it out to another lab, which everyone should do. I think anything
yeah.
that's dated should be double dated. And they used a different method this time, which I'll put in the show notes the episode where Genevieve explains the method that they used because she did a really good job of explaining it. But it was like spectron light something. I don't remember the name, but they basically see the last time that light had touched the contents in the footprint underneath.
OSL dating.
Yes, yes. And so the dates came up, I think, going back to 27,000 years, like 24 to 27. So it even pushed it back farther. And it just goes to show that, yes, people were in the Americas at least 25,000 years ago. And you're going to talk about Brazil, and Brazil is, I don't even know, but it probably at least 4,000 miles south.
It's
At
good that yeah.
at least.
It's a long walk.
Yeah, it's a very long walk, and, people during this time, they didn't just decide, "Okay, we're gonna walk as far as we can walk, and we're gonna make camp." They followed game, they followed legends and hopes even, but they never just, made an itinerary, "We're gonna hit these places by this time and get to Brazil." So it probably took a very long time to get there, and I think the art and the rock art you're gonna talk about is old. It's not even within Clovis range either.
It's
Um,
older than me.
so, we really need to get to this idea that, and I want to talk with you about what you think, and we will in a moment, how you think people got here, because there's a few ideas. But I would recommend, and maybe this will be in one of your book reviews that you're going to talk about on either this episode or any episode, because I think that's going to be a cool thing we're going to start incorporating on these Paleo Post podcasts,
Mm.
is book reviews that George is going to do, because they're awesome, is Origins by Dr. Jennifer Raff. Um, I don't know if you've read that one.
I haven't had the pleasure at the moment.
If you are interested in the not colonization, but it is the colonization, but the peopling of the Americas is
Yeah,
fascinating read. She
yeah.
takes it from an indigenous person's perspective and is extremely respectful of their culture and their ideas, but goes into the science of it and goes a lot into honestly how American anthropologists have abused indigenous people by taking their DNA and doing studies on them without them knowing about it and profiting off of all it. It's a very interesting book with a ton of great information on how we got here. But there are a few methods. So why don't you talk about what you
Yeah,
mentioned about Brazil, and then we can talk about maybe how they even got there.
I think also, Seth. I think let's be controversial about this. It'd be
Sure.
great to get people who maybe disagree with us
Yes.
to to write in and say, "Oi, you two, what do you think you're talking about?"
That
I
yeah. Why don't we let's open this up right now for
yeah,
anyone who for season 2 of the Paleo Post Podcast. If you want to make a comment, if you have a topic you want us to discuss, or maybe a specific question for one of us to answer, you can either comment on this video on this episode wherever you're listening to it, or you can email me and I'll put the email in the description, but it's real simple. It's worldofpaleoanthropology@gmail.com. And George and I will do our best to either argue with you and prove you wrong, or maybe we'll be wrong and we'll learn something new. And
or compromise.
we'll compromise. All right,
Yeah.
so I'll hand it back to you.
Okay. Well, look, I think what's interesting is that again we're very fortunate. We are living in a period of time where research around the world is really rewriting a lot of the textbooks. And this brings me to an interesting point. As you already mentioned, has been, certainly in North America, this very, very staunch conservative idea about Clovis and how there can never be pre-Clovis colonization of the Americas. So I initially took this on board, being an undergraduate, go, yeah, okay, I get it. Nothing before 10,000 BC, I'll live with that. And then I had the pleasure of going to Brazil, northeastern Brazil, to the World Heritage area called the Capivara, and remarkable sort of sandstone massif in the middle of what we call Katanga Forest. And I was there for about a month doing various things. I was at a congress first of all, and I started to sort of thought to myself, well, putting my sort of BBC hat on, I just produced a BBC program, a series of programs, and I thought, well, this could make a really good story. So I interviewed two people about the idea. This is what got me thinking. So there's a guy called Andre Praus, who's a Brazilian rock art specialist, quite famous within his part of the world, and a guy called Professor Luis Usterbeck, who is professor at University of Coimbra in Portugal. And I asked both the fundamental question. Well, we've got rock art here, allegedly, which is pre-Clovis. where are we as modern humans coming from? And so Andre Prost did an absolutely fantastic sort of deconstruction. He said, well, let's look south. Is anything coming from the south? No, of course, the south of Brazil is Antarctica, Argentina, and then Antarctica. So that's no. Pacific, big expanse of water, no. The Atlantic Ocean, big expanse of water, so probably no. There's only one area, and he just pointed upwards, i.e., it's coming from North America. So that got me thinking. And at the same time that I was in Brazil, we had the big debacle. I don't know if you've heard about it at all, Seth, but it was Keswick Man. Have you come across that at all?
Unfortunately, I know too much about him because
Right.
the white guy that was arguing for Kennewick Man being a European was a well-known practical neo-Nazi in the same. Oh, I have no shame in saying it, and I'll say his name.
Yeah.
I've shamed this man out of everything he's done. I've got
Yeah.
his events canceled. We share the same spiritual beliefs, but we go about them extraordinarily differently.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
extraordinarily differently. Like, for example, and again, not to get too off topic, he believes only white Europeans can follow this way. Well, I believe anyone who has the mind to can. And so everything with him was very Eurocentric. So
Yeah.
yes, can you tell us what Kennewick Man was? And just know in your mind and everyone listening the asinine argument that this was against these poor indigenous people. Go for
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Well, my point was that at some point, pre-Clovis, we've got a colonization from wherever, and again, I refer you to Paisley Caves, where we've now got. Well, when the first excavations took place there, quite a few years ago, about 20, 25 years ago, we had dates of around about 12, 13,000, which were believable because they they fitted well within the Clovis question. And they could be wrong, of course, because as we well know, you can't take radiocarbon dating too seriously until you get multiple dates or
Right.
split dating. So, and they weren't doing split dating then. But now we've got dates of 18,000. So that tells me something's going on pre-Clovis. So and you've got also caves in Alaska. So something is going on about movement of people coming down, and I think it's coming down in waves over maybe 50,000 years. And the reason why I say that is because when I was in Capivara, there was a French anthropologist, Nia de Guidon, and Anne-Marie Pressé, they're both working there. And they were working on a couple of cave sites, one in particular, Pedra Ferrada, which is a beautiful cave site, well, rock shelter site, sorry, with fantastic rock art. And they had actually excavated 80% of the deposits within that rock shelter site, and actually got down to the base of the rock shelter. And they found within the sequence two questionable problems. And the questionable problems were there was a lot of quartzite tools, around about 7,000 of them being found. And the big problem was that above the rock shelter was quartzite geology. So there was the counter argument saying that the quartzite fell off and down onto the ground, shattered conchoidally, because that's what flint does. That's what a lot of the quartzite type um, uh, stones do, and by accident, the that you get these potential tools being made, but naturally. So that's question number one. Problem number one, and the other problem was they found evidence of fire at 50,000, and again the counter argument to that could be, well, it's lightning and it's hitting Katanga forest, which is dry and therefore bursting into flames, and therefore there's your fire. So again, there's two big problems there, but it doesn't take into consideration that some of the rock shelters around Pedra Ferrada were yielding within excavation some of the veneer of the surfaces of the limestone that have been painted, which had cracked off and fallen into the stratigraphy, and that stratigraphy was excavated alongside radiocarbon dated material such as charcoal, such as organic material that can be dated, and you can then provide an indirect date between the stone in the stratigraphy and the radiocarbon sampling. And they did it a number of times. It wasn't just a one-off, and they got dates between 27 and 32,000 before present. So that tells me, first of all, that the Clovis, the pre-Clovis concept is turned upside down. You have to also accept the idea that there's a big problem with, I think, and forgive me for some American universities, but a lot of the American universities financing this thing were Catholic universities, for example, which have a very, very strong religious sort of agenda to fulfill, and
Right.
so therefore they're going to make, they want to keep within that sort of conservative range of 10,000 BC and before nothing, but 10,000 BC and afterwards something. So I get that, but it's arguable, and it can be sort of sorted out through discussion and whatever, and also through now hard science. So we've got a number of cave sites, both in New Mexico and in Oregon, Paisley Caves, and in Alaska, and in also in northern Canada, along that corridor, which was meant to be ice-free for communities from the Bering Sea and from the surrounding islands. Let's face it, these people are indigenous, but they're only indigenous because they've been there a long time.
Mhm.
And if we are looking at Kenwick Man, who I think has a date of around about 6 to 7,000 BP before present,
I
something like
don't
that.
recall. I just remember the DNA results.
Right. Okay. But it was quite. So what did this guy, this gentleman of the right wing, was saying was obviously wrong. However, they must have come from somewhere, and
Right.
I believe at one point America was, like most of the rest of the world, uninhabited, but it became inhabited by people moving across the globe. And I think it's in that point, 70, 80, 90, 100, 120,000 years ago that we started getting people moving in. And I think in some respects, what I quite find amusing is that I put up slides to my students of a map of the world with all the dates where we've got human occupation, modern human occupation, and it comes to the Americas, and it's still 10,000. Well, I have to laugh about it because I once believed it, but I don't believe it for 1 minute now because of the archaeological evidence that's been coming through, and also brave archaeologists and brave anthropologists are prepared to buck the trend. Because again, if you are dealing with a particular agenda, political agenda, and it is a political agenda which has a religious undertone to it as well, to suit your way of thinking and your ideology, then you've got to admire these people who stand out and say, look, oh, hang on a minute, we've got Paisley Caves here, which have yielded dates of 13,000 and 18,000. You go down to South America, which weren't meant to be colonized until around about 9,000 BP.
Yeah.
Hang on a minute, we've got stuff at 27,000, 29,000, 32,000. You go to Chile, we've got dates of 50,000. There's a settlement site excavated by an American university team. I forget which one it was. They got dates of 50,000. We've got stuff in Argentina as well, which is yielding very, very early dates as well. So quite clearly, again, this is the rule according to George Nash. We've got a series of waves of occupation coming through those areas where it is ice-free, and they are colonizing the Americas in very different ways. And this is the reason why we've got such a diverse indigenous population going right through North America, right through Central America, and right through South America. Over to you.
What are your thoughts on the Kelp Highway hypothesis versus along with the Bering Strait idea?
I quite like the Bering Strait idea, and I think that's the only idea at the moment that I can accept. Um, the one thing I haven't looked at as an archaeologist is to look at the geomorphology of that corridor. You know, how ice free was it, and how attractive. This is a good point to think about. If you are an indigenous community moving through that landscape for whatever reason, trying to seek that promised land, how inviting was that corridor to you, that community? And again, this is a philosophical discussion
Right.
rather than technical science discussion. You are faced with ice caps. Let me just get my left and my right sorted out. Yes, on my left hand side you've got a wall of ice, which is the Laurentide, part of the Laurentide, and then you've got the other side on the right hand side. You've got the Pacific Ocean, and this corridor. How big that corridor was, I'm not quite sure, but it was quite narrow. And again, I would like to see the evidence of or how accessible that corridor was, and how it would be attractive to people going south. They must have had a concept about the idea of how the rising and the setting of the sun, for example. They must have had some idea as well about if you move a few hundred kilometers south, it gets greener. So there's an incentive for one thing to think about. So I'm really a bearing straight man rather than the other idea.
I just looked it up out of curiosity, and at its most narrow point, and of course, when there was ice, this could have been different. But what the considered today the Bering Strait is only 55 miles wide.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're talking about a very small area that people would have.
And it would be visible. I think it would be visible, Seth, as well. We also forget about we're looking at the world in the 21st century, but 30,000-40,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, the landscape or the seascape would look a lot different. So, for example, a lot of the water that we see in the Pacific Ocean and the Bering Strait would have been locked up in ice. So, it's conceivable that the 55 miles you talk about may be much shorter, maybe only 20 miles. It may be also been visible to the naked eye. You standing on the eastern side of the Bering Strait, looking west. That's right. No, sorry, the other way around. You on the western side of the Bering Strait, looking east towards Alaska. It may be a more easier way. It's a bit like how people colonized Australia, because again, the argument is there that they went through Indonesia at some point around about 60,000 years ago. They could see Australia, but there was a bit of a expanse of water between the Indonesian side of the Indonesian mainland as it was, and the tip of Australia. So again, it's a philosophical question more than an archaeological one. It's that need, that incentive to go across that water and to seek the promised land. And again, another thing which we haven't thought about is the idea about how animals were moving through that landscape as well. Because again, that would be another attraction. And if you're following animals south, you know that and it's getting warmer and warmer, and you're seeing more green in terms of prairies and whatever, and the mosses, the sedges, the lichens, all attracting these animals. Then that would be in a place to sort of hang out, and have your community. And that's the reason why you got places like Paisley Cave, Paisley Cave system, which is around again similar to what you were talking about with the site in New Mexico. It's around a large lake, and which is I think is no longer. It's a paleo lake. But again, just interesting what's coming out in terms of dates. And I dare say, if we're sat here in 10 years' time, we'll change our minds completely, because we'll have obviously more data about what is going on in terms of the archaeology and the paleoanthropology of this specific question that we're trying to work out about the colonization of the Americas.
Well, guys, I hope you are enjoying the Paleo Post podcast so far. George and I decided that due to the length of this episode, we're going to split it up into parts. So this is the official end of part 1, and you can look forward to part 2 next week to recap the end of 2023. We hope you all had a great time listening. I hope you enjoy our new co-host, and there is so much more to come in the future. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed, please share, like, and subscribe. Bye.